It's the summer of 1943. 1,000 Allied bombers fill the German sky, silver fortresses glinting in sunlight. Engines roar, bombs whistle, and the air trembles. Suddenly, one of the B-17 gunners spots something a flicker below the clouds, moving impossibly fast. He squints. It's no Focke-Wulf, no Messerschmitt, it's something else. And before anyone can shout, it streaks upward silent, sleek, and unlike anything seen before. The formation explodes into panic. One bomber bursts into flames, another breaks apart in mid-air. No one even sees what hit them. The pilot only remembers a shimmering blur and a sound he would later describe as a scream from the future. That sound was the Me-262, except this never happened. Not in 1943, not when it mattered most, because the jet that could have changed the air war, the aircraft that was years ahead of its time, arrived too late to save the Reich that built it. But what if it hadn't? What if Germany's miracle jet, the world's first operational fighter, powered by pure jet thrust, had appeared 2 years earlier? When the Allies were still vulnerable, when their bombers had no escort fighters, when their radar and command networks were far less prepared. Would the sky over Europe have become a slaughterhouse for Allied air crews? Would D-Day have been delayed or even cancelled? Would the outcome of the war itself have shifted even slightly? These are the questions that haunt aviation historians to this day, because the Me-262 was not science fiction. It was real, it flew, and its potential was so terrifying that Allied pilots called it the warplane from another world. Before anyone had even heard the word jet, before the war had swallowed Europe whole, a handful of German engineers were already building the future. It began in secret laboratories, dim rooms, echoing with the hum of experimental engines. The year was 1938. While most of the world still believed air combat would be decided by propellers, Germany was already chasing a dream that seemed impossible: flight by pure thrust. At the center of this dream was a young physicist named Hans von Ohain, working quietly at Heinkel's facility. He built a small engine that didn't rely on pistons or propellers. It burned air and fuel directly to create thrust. In August of 1939, just weeks before the invasion of Poland, a strange, stubby aircraft lifted off from a German airfield. It was the Heinkel He-178, the world's first jet-powered plane. It flew only for a few minutes, but those few minutes changed everything. The German Air Ministry saw the flight and nodded politely. Then they went back to focusing on Bf 109 seconds, Ju 88 seconds, and other piston-engine warplanes. The future had arrived, and nobody noticed. By 1940, Messerschmitt engineers, led by Willy Messerschmitt himself, began designing a true jet fighter, faster, stronger, and deadlier than anything before it. The prototype, what would become the Me-262, took shape in their blueprints. It had sleek, swept wings, twin nacelles under the fuselage, and a design that promised speeds near 500 miles an hour. But there was one problem: no engine could power it. The Jumo 004 turbojet existed only on paper, so when the first Me-262 prototype finally flew in 1940, it had to be pushed into the sky by a small piston engine in its nose. A jet plane, running on propeller power, it was a cruel irony, like the future being dragged forward by the past. Still, the engineers persisted. Von Ohain's and Junkers' teams worked day and night, burning through scarce materials, chasing the perfect turbine. They succeeded eventually. But by the time the Me-262's true jet engines were finally ready for combat, the war had already turned against Germany. The tragedy isn't that the jet failed. It's that it existed too soon for the world to believe in it. While Allied pilots were still perfecting their Spitfires and Thunderbolts. The Germans had already opened the door to the future and then hesitated to step through. If the Me-262 had been pushed harder, if its creators had been given full backing when it mattered most, it could have entered combat in early 1943. And that single decision or lack of one may have rewritten history. 1943 was the year the air over Germany began to burn. The Allies had grown stronger, bolder, and relentless. American bombers now reached deep into the Reich in broad daylight, escorted by P-38 seconds and P-47 seconds aircraft that could finally cross the Channel and return home. City after city vanished beneath waves of fire. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin. Factories, refineries, even churches all consumed. It was the year German pilots realized that courage alone could not save them. The Luftwaffe's best men like Adolf Galland, Walter Novotny, and Günther Roll were watching their world collapse from above. The numbers were simply impossible. For every German fighter that took off, 10 Allied aircraft waited in the sky. The bomber streams were endless flying fortresses stacked from horizon to horizon. And yet, hidden deep in Bavaria, a miracle was almost ready to rise. By mid-1942, the WW2 jet engine had roared to life. It wasn't perfect, it shook, burned out quickly, and devoured fuel, but it worked. For the first time, Germany had a power plant that could make the Me-262 a reality. Test pilots returned from early flights stunned. One of them wrote, "You push the throttle, and the horizon rushes backward. You don't fly the Me-262, it drags the world beneath you." At full power, the prototype topped 540 miles per hour, nearly 150 miles faster than anything the Allies could field. It could climb faster, dive deeper, and strike before enemies even knew it was there. By every measure, it was ready or close enough. But inside the Reich Air Ministry, chaos ruled. There were too many voices, too many priorities. Some wanted the jet as an interceptor, others demanded it become a fighter bomber. Still others said, "It's too expensive. We need more Messerschmitt 109 seconds, not fancy toys." The truth was, by 1943, Germany's industrial system was crumbling. Allied bombing shredded production lines. Nickel, chromium, and tungsten metals vital for jet turbines were vanishing. Even fuel was rationed. Flight testing often halted for lack of kerosene. Yet the Me-262 could have entered limited service. Messerschmitt's engineers pleaded for mass production. Galland begged the High Command to approve it, warning that the next year would bring annihilation. But Hitler's inner circle was divided, distracted, and desperate to chase revenge weapons like the V-2 rocket. By the end of 1943, a handful of Me-262 seconds were flying prototypes only. They were magnificent and completely useless, because by the time Germany realized what it truly had, the moment had already slipped away. That was the year, the perfect window, when the jet could have turned the air war on its head. Had the Me-262 entered combat then, Allied bombers would have faced a nightmare unlike anything in history. But the nightmare never came. Instead, a new one, political and personal, was about to begin. A single order would twist the jet's destiny forever. By late 1943, the Me-262 was ready to roar into the skies. Its twin WW2 engines finally worked barely. Its armament of 4.30mm Mk108 cannons could shred a B-17 inches seconds, and its speed, 540 miles an hour. No Allied aircraft could match that, not even close. The Luftwaffe's generals knew what they had. Men like Adolf Galland, the ace with more than 100 victories, had flown the prototype himself. He returned from his test flight speechless, then declared, "This is the weapon that will win back our skies." To him, it was obvious. The Me-262 was a defensive miracle. a pure fighter, designed to intercept and destroy the endless streams of bombers leveling Germany's cities. But one man saw it differently: Adolf Hitler. In November 1943, at a meeting in East Prussia, the Führer was shown drawings and films of the Me-262. He sat silently for a moment, then leaned forward and asked, "Can it carry bombs?" Willy Messerschmitt hesitated. "Technically, yes, my Führer, but it's designed as a fighter," Hitler interrupted. "No. Germany needs a Blitz bomber, a fast attack plane to strike London, to deliver revenge." The room fell silent. The jet that could have saved Germany's air defense had just been turned into a bomber by decree. Engineers protested. Galland argued that adding bomb racks would ruin the jet's balance and slow it down. But Hitler's word was law. He envisioned Me-262 screaming over the Channel, dropping explosives on British soil faster than any Spitfire could intercept. To him, defense was defeatism, attack meant power. So the program shifted overnight. Designers had to modify the nose, strengthen the frame, add bomb mounts, recalibrate flight controls, all for a role it was never meant to perform. Months were lost. Crucial momentum was gone. When Galland later met with Hitler again to plead for fighter production, the Führer exploded. He accused the Luftwaffe of cowardice. "You only think defensively," he shouted. "The bomber is the weapon of victory." Galland walked out, furious and defeated. Behind closed doors, he told his pilots, "We've lost the war, we just don't know it yet." The Me-262's fate was sealed by pride. The air defense miracle had been turned into a vanity project, the toy of a dictator who refused to admit the sky no longer belonged to him. Had it entered service in early 1943, hundreds of Me-262 might have patrolled Germany's airspace, ripping through Allied bombers at will. Instead, the engineers wasted half a year trying to turn the future into a bomber. And by the time the first combat-ready fighters finally appeared, the Allies had already begun adapting, preparing new escort tactics, new radar nets, and a countermeasure that would meet the jet head-on. Picture the sky over Europe in 1943, endless streams of silver bombers crawling toward the German heartland. The Allies believed they owned the air. They flew in daylight, confident in their formations and their heavy guns. They had no reason to look behind them. And then one morning something new appeared on their radar screens. It was small, fast, too fast. The blips came and went before ground controllers could react. Moments later, the bombers began to fall. A new sound ripped across the sky, not the steady drone of engines, but a shriek, deep and metallic, like tearing fabric. B-17 crews described it as being attacked by ghosts. There was no warning, no dogfight, just sudden flashes and fire. It was the Me-262, Germany's jet interceptor, unleashed in 1943. And for the first time since the war began, Allied pilots were terrified. A single Me-262 could dart through a bomber formation at more than 500 miles an hour, fire its 30mm cannons, and vanish before the gunners could even aim. Its shells tore through aluminum like paper. Entire bombers disintegrated mid-air. Even the P-47 and P-38, the pride of American escort fleets, were helpless. They were too slow, too heavy, too bound by the laws of piston power. Against the Me-262, they looked prehistoric. Allied air commanders would have faced an impossible question: continue the daylight bombing campaign or abandon it altogether? Because if Me-262 squadrons had existed in significant numbers in early 1943, the carnage would have been catastrophic. Thousands of bomber crews could have been lost in weeks. Morale would have shattered. Production back home of bombers, tanks, ammunition could have slowed under public outrage. And The ripple effects wouldn't stop there. Without sustained Allied bombing, Germany's industrial capacity might have survived longer. Synthetic fuel plants vital to the Luftwaffe would have kept running. Tank factories could have continued feeding the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht might have slowed the Soviet advance, buying Hitler the one thing he never had: time. Now imagine the invasion of Normandy delayed 6 months, maybe a year. Imagine Allied troops landing under skies still controlled by German jets. Every bomber, every ship, every movement exposed to Me-262 strikes from above. The Allies had overwhelming numbers, yes, but technology can rewrite numbers, at least for a while. And in 1943, the Me-262 would have been nearly untouchable. Even with its flaws, short engine life, high maintenance, limited range, it could have shattered Allied confidence. It could have changed the rhythm of the war, forcing the Allies to fight cautiously, slowly, expensively. Would it have won the war for Germany? No. But it could have prolonged it maybe by a year, maybe more, and that extra time could have meant horrors we can't imagine: new rocket weapons, advanced submarines, even atomic research catching up. History turns on moments of hesitation, and in 1943, that hesitation was written in metal: the Me-262, waiting on a runway, its engines ready, while politicians argued. For all its brilliance, the Me-262 was still a machine built inside a dying empire. Every time its engines screamed to life, they consumed metal. Germany no longer had nickel, cobalt, chromium elements the Allies controlled through global trade. The Junkers Jumo 004 engines were engineering marvels, yes, but they were fragile. Each one lasted barely 25 hours before it burned itself apart. At full throttle, the turbine blades warped from heat. A single bird strike could destroy an entire engine. Maintenance crews struggled constantly. They had to replace parts by hand, using improvised materials scavenged from wrecked aircraft. Even finding fuel became a nightmare. The Me-262's jets required kerosene refined to specific standards, and by late 1943, Germany was rationing gasoline for ambulances. Then there was training. A jet handled nothing like a propeller plane. Throttle too fast, and the engine flamed out. Throttle too slow, and it stalled. Luftwaffe pilots, already dying in droves, had no time to retrain. Many who climbed into the Me-262 had only a few hours of flight time, and those first flights often killed them. In one tragic report, a test pilot named Hans Guido Mutke wrote that he reached speeds near 600 miles an hour faster than any man before him, before losing control. The jet shook violently, wings fluttering, controls stiff as concrete. He barely pulled out alive. For days afterward, he couldn't stop trembling. He later said, "It was like flying a thunderstorm made of steel." Even if Germany had fielded hundreds of Me-262 seconds in 1943, the logistics would have been impossible. Every crash meant an irreplaceable loss. Every damaged engine meant a week of repairs, if spare parts even existed, and every gallon of fuel burned meant less for the tanks fighting in Russia. The jet could win dogfights, but not wars. Wars are won by supply chains, factories, training schools, and fuel depots. By 1943, Germany's were already being reduced to rubble. And even if the Me-262 had entered combat early, the Allies would have adapted quickly. They always did. Radar systems could have been tuned to detect faster targets. P-51, Mustangs still on drawing boards at the time, could have been accelerated into production months sooner. British intelligence, already aware of mysterious German jets, might have rushed development of the Gloucester Meteor, Britain's own jet. The world was ready to follow. All it needed was a reason. And the Me-262 would have been that reason. Germany could have shocked the skies, but it couldn't sustain the storm. A jet built for dominance would have become a burden, a miracle weapon that devoured the very resources Germany was running out of. Because in war, innovation is useless without endurance. And by 1943, Germany had none left. They called it Schwalbe the Swallow. It was supposed to soar above everything. But for most who flew it, the Me-262 felt more like a razor-edged trap. By the time the first combat squadrons formed, Germany's skies were already burning. The Allies bombed airfields day and night. Pilots slept in craters beside their planes. Fuel trucks never arrived. Runways were shredded by explosions. And yet, the Me-262 still rolled out sleek, silver, and terrifyingly fast. The few who flew it were elite, men like Adolf Galland, commander of JV-44, a secretive unit nicknamed the Squadron of the Experts. Every man there was an ace, veterans of hundreds of dogfights, survivors of impossible odds. They were given the most advanced aircraft in the world, but also the most cursed. The Me-262's takeoff was lethal. Its twin engines needed a full minute to spool up. Allied fighters learned to attack during that window, strafing jets as they struggled to climb. Many exploded before leaving the ground. One pilot recalled, "It wasn't a question of courage, it was a question of chance. You prayed the engines would hold and that no Mustang was waiting." When they did make it into the sky, everything changed. The Me-262 accelerated like nothing they'd ever felt, a shove in the chest, a thunderous surge that blurred the horizon. At that speed, combat felt unreal. Dogfights were over before they began. They could appear behind a bomber group, fire their cannons, and vanish. A few managed to down 5 or 6 bombers in a single sortie. But for every victory, there was another loss, often mechanical, sometimes fatal. Engines flamed out mid-air, landing gear collapsed on return, runways too short for the jet's speed caused crashes that tore aircraft apart. Pilots started calling the Me-262 the Widowmaker from the future. Still, they loved it. They knew they were flying something no one else on Earth possessed, the first step into a new era of aviation. Galland himself said, "It was like riding a cannonball through the sky. You could feel history under your wings." But history, by then, was against them. There were never enough jets, never enough parts, never enough time. When Allied reconnaissance finally photographed the Me-262, the reaction was immediate. Commanders ordered constant patrols near known jet bases. Mustangs prowled runways, waiting for takeoffs. Every time a Me-262 appeared, it drew a swarm of Allied fighters like vultures to prey. By 1945, the few remaining pilots of JV-44 flew knowing they were doomed. They weren't defending a nation anymore, they were defending a memory. Each mission was suicide in slow motion. One pilot's diary ended with a single line, "We fly into the future, but it will belong to someone else." They were right. When the war ended, their aircraft, the same machines that had been too late to save Germany, were captured, studied, and copied. Within a decade, America, Britain, and the Soviet Union would all fly jets descended from the Me-262. The men who flew it had glimpsed tomorrow, but they never lived to see it take flight. By 1943, Allied intelligence was already picking up whispers, intercepted radio chatter, captured engineers, a few blurry photographs of sleek, swept-wing aircraft seen near Augsburg. British analysts scribbled notes in disbelief. Jet propulsion? Unconfirmed. Most dismissed it as German bluffing or an experimental curiosity too complex for wartime production. They were wrong. When the first Me-262 wreckage was recovered in late 1944, the truth hit like a thunderclap. The Allies hadn't just underestimated Germany's science, they'd underestimated how close they came to losing the skies. In debriefings after the war, one RAF officer said, "If that machine had appeared even a year earlier, our daylight bombing would have ended in a week." Another, the legendary test pilot Eric Winkle Brown, flew a captured Me-262 himself. He later wrote, "It was like shaking hands with the future. Had it come earlier, the air war would have been hell. Even the Americans were stunned." General Carl Spaatz, who oversaw the 8th Air Force's bombing campaign, admitted privately, "If they'd had 500 of these in '43, we'd have had to stop. Imagine the invasion of Normandy, but under skies ruled by jets. Paratroopers falling into flak-filled darkness, bombers torn apart before reaching their targets, ships strafed at 500 miles an hour. Would Eisenhower have risked D-Day without air supremacy? Would the war in Europe have ended in 1945 at all? The Me-262 wasn't just a weapon, it was a prophecy. It revealed a future where speed and technology would define every battle. A future that terrified those who understood it. The Allies studied every piece they could find. Within months, British and American engineers were designing their own turbojets using the Me-262 as a model. The Soviet Union, too, seized German scientists and shipped them east. What began as a desperate German miracle would ignite the Cold War's arms race jet by jet, nation by nation. But for all the power it represented, there was something almost tragic about the Me-262. It had come too late to change the war, yet too early to be forgotten. It was a machine born in desperation, misunderstood by its own creators, and respected only by its enemies. When Allied troops entered the captured airfields of Bavaria in the spring of 1945, they found rows of strange, silver aircraft half buried in mud. Some had been blown apart by their own crews. Others sat intact, silent, untouched, almost beautiful. They looked like something from another century. The soldiers didn't know it, but they were staring at the first true machines of the modern age. The Me-262 was not just a fighter, it was the end of an era, the last weapon of an empire that had already fallen apart before it ever took off. Its story is one of irony too cruel to believe. The same brilliance that gave it wings was crushed by arrogance and politics. The same nation that built it couldn't afford to fuel it, and the same pilots who flew it did so, knowing they were defending ashes. In another world, one where the Me-262 flew in early 1943 history might have trembled differently. The Allied bombing campaign might have stalled. The war might have dragged on for another year or longer. Tens of thousands more might have died. The map of Europe might have looked unrecognizable. But that didn't happen. Because for all its innovation, the Me-262 was built by a regime that could no longer think clearly. Its leaders obsessed over revenge instead of reality. And in doing so, they buried their miracle beneath pride. Yet, the legacy of the jet didn't die in the ruins of Germany. Its blueprints crossed oceans. Its engineers were taken by both the Americans and the Soviets, the opening move of a new kind of war. Within 5 years, the Me-262's DNA would appear in the wings of the F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15, and the Comet, the first commercial jetliner. The future had survived, even if its creators hadn't. And so, in a strange way, the Me-262 did change the world, just not for the people who built it. When Adolf Galland was asked, years later, what it felt like to fly the Me-262, he paused for a long time. Then he said quietly, "It was like seeing the sun rise while knowing night would last forever." The jet had come too late to save Germany, but it arrived just in time to shape the next century. Its scream through the air marked the death of one world and the birth of another, the age of speed, the age of power, the age of man's endless reach for domination through technology. In the end, the Me-262 wasn't a weapon of victory. It was a warning forged in desperation, wasted by pride, and remembered in awe. If it had appeared 2 years earlier, would it have changed the war? Perhaps, but more likely, it would have only delayed the inevitable, another tragedy written in fire. The Me-262's true story isn't about what it could have done. It's about what it meant, proof that human brilliance and human folly can share the same cockpit.